Have you ever wondered if you're truly safe driving on a deserted road at night? Many believe the greatest dangers come from robberies or accidents, but what if I told you there's a place where drivers simply disappear? That's right. Cars are found intact, engines running, but with no one inside. And the most disturbing thing is that this phenomenon repeats itself over and over again on the same stretch, as if the road had a life of its own. Before continuing, have you subscribed to the channel? This helps me bring more investigations like this, as well as strengthen this community that seeks answers to the unexplained. The story you're about to hear today isn't just about a road, it's about fears that haunt us, enigmas that science can't explain, and scars we carry as humanity. It's no coincidence, no media invention, and certainly no mere coincidence. Here, disappearances happen to ordinary people, entire families, and even police officers, all swallowed up by the same void. And most intriguingly, every detail of this road connects to something larger, a pattern that spans borders and centuries. I'm Katherine, an investigator of cases that defy logic, and I've traveled this path in search of answers. What I've discovered goes beyond imagination. Hidden documents, enigmatic symbols, survivor accounts, and historical connections that reveal this place was never just a stretch of asphalt. It's a stage where reality and mystery collide, and where every turn seems to bring us closer to a forbidden secret. Brace yourself, because this isn't a story to just listen to, it's an experience that will make you question your own perception of reality. The case of the never-ending road is more than a local mystery, it's a disturbing reminder that there are forces that neither the police, nor science, nor faith can completely control. And deep down, you might discover that this path isn't so far removed from your own life, after all. When I first heard about the road that never ends, I confess I thought it was a popular exaggeration, like those grandmotherly stories meant to scare children. But I soon realized there was more to it than mere rumor. The construction of this road dates back to the 1950s, when the government of the time decided to connect small, forgotten towns in the countryside with large commercial centers. Interestingly, no one has ever been able to clearly explain who actually financed the project, as official documents were always full of errors. This detail caught my attention, because when something starts wrong, it usually ends in mystery. I've investigated cases myself, where a misplaced signature on a document or an overlooked detail in a contract revealed secrets no one wanted exposed. And this road had exactly that smell of an unsolved mystery. Longtime residents say the inauguration was almost rushed, with no celebrations, no banners, just a discreet ribbon cutting. Strange, isn't it? A project of this magnitude, promising economic development, was received without fanfare. It's as if everyone knew deep down that something dark was already embedded in that asphalt. In my interviews with older people, I heard stories filled with nostalgia, but also fear. They described the road as a seemingly endless path, even in the early years of use. Some drivers reported that, when crossing it in the early hours of the morning, they felt as if they were stuck in a loop, driving for miles without seeing any change in scenery. This sense of déjà vu on the road wasn't just psychological. Some even lost track of time, swearing they'd driven for hours when in reality they'd traveled less than 20 minutes. This detail began to intrigue me deeply. It was there that I understood that the road's origins couldn't be analyzed solely from a historical or political perspective. It carried an atmosphere, an energy, almost as if it had been designed to confuse anyone who dared to travel it. This reminded me of cases I'd studied in other parts of the world, where public works were shrouded in ancient legends and inexplicable events. And believe me, when there's a combination of untold history and mysteries that endure the test of time, there's always something deeper lurking, ready to be revealed, and it was precisely at this point that the investigation began to take on an even more enigmatic tone. I grew up hearing that every road carries a story, but this one seemed to hold a whole book of secrets. Old-timers spoke of figures appearing at the side of the road even before asphalt existed. Just imagine, when it was still just a dirt trail, travelers reported encounters with strange figures, walking silently and vanishing into thin air. These legends weren't told as jokes, but as warnings. It was almost as if this land had been marked by something that wouldn't fade with time. I remember a woman I once interviewed. She described, with tears in her eyes, how her grandfather disappeared in 1912, long before the road was officially opened. He had apparently taken that improvised route and never returned. It was as if the ground had swallowed him, she told me, clasping her hands as if holding a secret. This kind of story was repeated frequently, and what was most disturbing was that the details overlapped across generations. It wasn't just popular imagination, there was a disturbing consistency to these memories. In my research, I've always learned that when stories are repeated from generation to generation, it's because they carry some kind of truth. Perhaps not literal, but symbolic, revealing that something was indeed wrong. A driver from the 1930s reported, in a diary found after his death, that he had seen a cart pull ahead of him, pulled by horses that left no tracks. When he tried to catch up, the cart would suddenly disappear. This account gave me chills, because it connects with the idea that the stretch of road was considered cursed long before the asphalt was laid. And the most curious thing is how these legends shaped the local culture. To this day, there are families who refuse to pass through there, even with GPS, flashlights, and all the modern technology. They believe that ancient spirits guard the path, imprisoning those who dare to cross during certain nights. The road, in this sense, didn't begin with mysteries after its construction. It was born from them. And the more I heard these stories, the more I realized we were only scratching the surface of an enigma that seemed to feed on the passage of time itself. The first officially documented disappearances began to appear in police files in the 1960s. Until then, legends had spread only by word of mouth, but now there were official records with names, dates, and police reports. I remember holding those yellowed folders in the police station filing cabinet. The smell of old paper mixed with the weight of stories never concluded. It was as if each page carried the silent scream of someone who had turned onto that road and was never seen again. One of the cases that most impacted me was that of a truck driver named Raoul. In 1963, he was transporting a load of simple furniture and was supposed to arrive at his destination in a few hours. But the curious thing is that the truck was found parked on the shoulder, engine running, headlights on, and no sign of the driver. No clothes, no documents, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. This detail reminded me a lot of international investigations into sudden disappearances, where the absence of traces is the most disturbing element. Another case, years later, involved an entire family, a father, a mother, and 2 young children. The car was found intact, with the child seat still secured, but without any trace of its occupants. Not even signs of a struggle or a hasty exit. This type of occurrence was so disconcerting that police began to avoid speaking publicly, fearing it would create panic. And I can understand, because the more we look at something that doesn't make sense, the more it seems to stare back at us, demanding an impossible explanation. These official disappearances gave the myth of the road a new lease on life. It was no longer just a popular superstition, but rather a mystery with material evidence. Archives, photographs, abandoned vehicles, personal belongings left behind. I always say that the most dangerous mysteries are those that blend legend with tangible evidence. And on that road, each recorded case was like another piece in a puzzle that, instead of fitting together, seemed to fall apart with each attempt to fit it together. And the most disturbing part was yet to come. When I began studying the profiles of the people who disappeared along this stretch, I expected to find a clear pattern: night drivers, lone travelers, or even criminals on the run. But the road wasn't choosy. There were experienced truck drivers, ordinary families on vacation, young people returning from parties, and even off-duty police officers. This diversity intrigued me, because when a mystery doesn't follow an apparent logic, it's a sign that something deeper is at work behind the scenes. I remember interviewing the daughter of one of the missing men, a simple family man who worked as a street vendor. She told me he was a careful man, never risked traveling without checking his car, and had no enemies. His disappearance showed that it wasn't a matter of recklessness or bad luck. The road seemed to choose its own. This made me reflect on how real life often doesn't follow predictable paths. Even the most cautious can be surprised. As I analyzed police records, I noticed that many missing people shared a curious characteristic. They were at a transitional moment in their lives. Some were moving to another city, others were leaving jobs, and others were starting relationships. This detail may seem insignificant, but as an investigator, I've learned that coincidences are rarely just coincidences. Perhaps the road became a symbolic stage, as if it attracted precisely those ready to cross some kind of boundary, not just physical, but also existential. This pattern made me think about how we all, at some point, have crossed roads that never end in our own lives, situations where we feel trapped, with no way out, driving on without seeing change on the horizon. The enigma of this road seemed to reflect something larger. It wasn't just about physical disappearances, but also about internal journeys that many livelets endure. And when I realized this, I understood that the mystery was about to deepen even further. Every road has its critical points, but this stretch, oh, this one is different. Those who have driven along it describe the sensation of crossing a kind of void suspended in time. It's a relatively short stretch, about 2 miles, but it seems to stretch on indefinitely when driving at night. There are no streetlights. The trees lean over the asphalt as if trying to swallow passers-by, and the fog that forms there is so dense that even headlights seem useless. It was at this very point that most of the disappearances occurred. Once, I decided to drive this stretch alone, just to feel what so many have described. The clock struck midnight when I got in, and I swear I felt like the car wouldn't move. The speedometer showed 80 kilometers, but the surrounding trees seemed frozen, as if I were in a photograph. I checked the GPS several times, and the route showed me stationary, even though I was moving. The anguish I felt was so intense that to this day, I remember my heart pounding against my chest like a drum. Drivers claim to have seen repeated signs, as if they were passing the same spot several times. Others describe hearing strange sounds, footsteps, distant voices, a child's cries coming from the nearby woods. A retired police officer even reported that, while pulling over to the side of the road, he heard someone calling his name, even though no one was around. These details may seem fanciful, but when they're repeated in so many different accounts, they begin to take on a disturbing weight. This stretch of road has earned the nickname the Cursed Kilometer among locals. A simple designation, but loaded with meaning. It's not just a dot on the map. It's almost like a border between the world we know and one that insists on hiding. And the more I investigated this particular stretch of road, the more I realized that the disappearances weren't just isolated incidents, but part of a pattern that seemed to defy any logical explanation. Few have been lucky enough, or perhaps unlucky enough, to return from this stretch and tell what they experienced. These survivors, rare as needles in a haystack, carry rucksacks. I'll hardly forget. Their eyes are marked by something they can't explain, as if they've seen more than they should have. In all their testimonies, there's one thing in common: the feeling that the road stretched on endlessly, dragging them into an invisible labyrinth. A man named Sergio told me he was driving alone when he noticed his dashboard suddenly go dark. Headlights, speedometer, radio, everything was off. The vehicle, however, kept moving. He described the silence inside the car as so absolute that he could hear his own heartbeat. After a few minutes, or perhaps hours, as he lost track of time, the power suddenly came back on, and he found himself back where he'd started. For him, it was as if he'd been driving in a closed circle. Another witness, a young woman named Lydia, reported hearing voices in the back seat of the car, even though she was alone. The voices were low, like an intimate conversation, but she couldn't understand the words. Frightened, she accelerated as fast as she could, and before she knew it, she was in a neighboring town, unsure how she had traveled so many kilometers in such a short time. The strangest thing was that, according to her watch, only 5 minutes had passed. This kind of time distortion reminded me of investigations into abductions or out-of-body experiences. These survivor accounts reinforce the idea that these are not mere accidents or coincidences. There is a pattern of psychological, paranormal, and even physical experiences that defies comprehension. I always say, when different people from different places and times describe similar sensations, it's because there's something bigger behind them. And each testimony I gathered seemed to lead me deeper into the heart of this mystery, as if an even more disturbing revelation were about to emerge. Whenever cases like this arise, the first line of scientific investigation usually points to psychological explanations. And I won't deny it, there's strong evidence that this stretch of road causes some kind of mental disorientation. Experts speak of collective hallucinations, trance-like states, and even episodes of dissociation brought on by the stress of traveling. It makes sense. After all, when we're in monotonous and isolated environments, our minds create images, sounds, and sensations to fill the void. But the question is, why does this specific stretch of road trigger such reactions in so many different people? I remember a psychiatrist I interviewed, Dr. Henrique, who said that human beings have a tendency to project their fears onto the environment. According to him, if a driver has heard of the road's reputation, their brain may begin to produce illusions, such as figures, voices, and even the feeling of lost time. The problem is that not all survivors knew the story before passing through. In other words, how can one explain when someone with no prior reference reports exactly the same phenomena as others? In previous investigations, I've realized how treacherous our minds can be. I've seen cases of people who swore they saw strange figures, but in fact, they were exhausted or sleep-deprived. This could also apply to the road. Tired drivers, long nights, monotony, all of these are prime conditions for imagination to become reality. However, there is a limit. The mind can create sensations, but it can hardly alter electronic devices, turn off engines, or manipulate clocks, as various reports describe. These psychological explanations help us understand part of the phenomenon, but not the whole. The road seems to play with the mind, but it also leaves physical marks on the environment and on vehicles. It's as if there were a thin line between the psychological and the inexplicable, a space where reality and illusion mingle, and it was precisely at this boundary that I began to notice something even more disconcerting, something that pointed to much more concrete and at the same time darker explanations. Every investigation must begin with the tangible, and I confess, I clung to rational explanations, like someone holding a dim flashlight in the darkness. The road could be treacherous, poor signage, sharp curves, constant fog, and even stretches without a shoulder. This alone was enough to cause fatal accidents. There were also reports of criminals using the area for ambushes, robbing drivers, and disappearing with their victims. At first glance, it made sense, but as the cases began to pile up without a trace, I realized that logical reasoning wasn't filling the gaps. A highway engineer I interviewed hypothesized that the terrain might have geological formations capable of generating magnetic fields, interfering with compasses, radios, and even car operation. This theory has been used in other parts of the world to explain similar anomalies. Interestingly, measuring equipment did indeed record electromagnetic oscillations along the stretch, but none of sufficient intensity to explain the complete disappearal or entire vehicles. It was like trying to explain a giant fire by saying it all started with an extinguished candle. Another point I considered was organized crime. Yes, there was the possibility of gangs specializing in kidnapping, which attacked that location because it was isolated and difficult to monitor. But how could one justify intact cars, engines running, with no signs of violence? If it were a robbery, there would be signs of a struggle, tracks, or at least a pattern of cargo theft. Instead, what we found were scenes almost frozen in time, as if someone had pressed the pause button in real life. This made me partially dismiss that line of thinking. Despite all these attempts to rationalize, something always slipped through my fingers. The more I tried to explain, the more the facts seemed to mock logic. And it was at this point that I began to accept that, however uncomfortable it might be, we might be facing forces beyond the tangible. It was then that the boldest theories began to gain traction, bringing to the table explanations that, until then, I would have considered pure fantasy. When logic refuses to provide answers, the inevitable next step is to look for what escapes reason. That's exactly what happened to me during this investigation. Many locals believe that this stretch of road is actually a point of intersection between dimensions, a sort of invisible portal capable of swallowing up anyone who dares to cross it at specific moments. At first glance, it sounds like something out of a science fiction script, but after hearing dozens of similar accounts, I began to wonder if there wasn't some truth to this unlikely idea. Some mediums I visited described the road as a tear in the fabric of reality. They spoke with such conviction that it was disconcerting. One told me that spirits trapped in ancient massacres still roam there, seeking to drag the living into their dimension of pain. I confess that, as an investigator, I always keep my feet on the ground. But one night, when I walked the stretch accompanied by a psychic, the environment transformed before me. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air became heavy, almost unbreathable. The experience was, to say the least, unsettling. Furthermore, some argue that the place functions as a temporal anomaly. Drivers report feeling as if hours pass in minutes, or minutes stretch into hours. This time distortion is typical of paranormal narratives around the world, especially in regions known for swallowing people. Think of the Bermuda Triangle, or the infamous Dyatlov Pass in Russia. The road that never ends seems to be our own version of this phenomenon, and the more I compared the accounts, the more the pieces fit together. I'm not categorically claiming the explanation is paranormal, but it's impossible to ignore how these accounts defy all rationality. What's most intriguing is that, even without concrete physical evidence, the road continues to accumulate stories that reinforce this narrative. It's as if it itself wants to keep the mystery alive, forcing us to accept that there are forces beyond our control. And just as this thought began to solidify, something even more frustrating caught my attention: the history of official investigations that seemed doomed to failure from the start. When the disappearances began to attract media attention, the police had no choice but to act. Complex operations were organized, with patrol cars, drones, helicopters, and even sniffer dogs. I had access to some reports, and honestly, the frustration spilled from the pages. They searched the area countless times, but never found anything other than abandoned cars. No tracks, no signs of a struggle, no footprints. It was like searching for ghosts in broad daylight. The road seemed to mock every official attempt at a solution. A landmark incident occurred in 1987, when 50 officers were mobilized to monitor the stretch for 2 weeks straight. On the 10th day, 2 officers simply disappeared while patrolling in pairs. Their patrol car was found intact, with the radio blaring and the engine running. Their colleagues were only a few meters away, but swear they heard nothing. To this day, these men are listed as missing. It was from then on that the force began to treat the road with an uncomfortable silence. Talking to some retired investigators, I realized there was a kind of unspoken consensus. The road wasn't just dangerous, it was inexplicable. Many confessed to being afraid to admit this publicly, lest they tarnish their careers with a reputation for superstition. But in private conversations, they described feelings of dizziness, memory loss, and even strange dreams after working there. I've even seen experienced officers refuse to return, as if their profession itself had limits when faced with this enigma. The most intriguing thing is that, despite so many operations, there was never a conclusive official report. The files I consulted always ended with vague words: no evidence, inconclusive occurrence, investigation suspended. It was as if the road had the power to erase its own footprints. And this inability of the law to solve the case opened the way for another layer of speculation. Theories that pointed not to human error, but to something much more calculated, involving hidden agendas of authorities and even the military. In investigations like this, one question always arises: how far does the authorities' silence extend due to a lack of answers, and how far is it due to convenience? I discovered, through confidential files and discreet interviews, that rumors swirled that this stretch of highway was used in secret military operations in the 1970s. Some speak of testing space-time manipulation technology, others mention psychological experiments on drivers. The fact is that, whenever pressed, official bodies denied everything with suspicious speed. A former military officer I interviewed told me, in an almost conspiratorial tone, that the area near the road had been cordoned off on certain early mornings without any explanation to the population. Helicopters flew overhead, trucks came and went, and strangely, always during these periods, disappearances were reported. He believed these cases were not accidents, but side effects of something much larger. The road never ends because it's not a normal road. It's an open-air laboratory, he told me, before refusing to elaborate further. Over the years, independent journalists have attempted to investigate these connections. Some report receiving veiled threats, others having their work censored. A documentary filmmaker, for example, who was preparing a special about the road, had his footage mysteriously erased from the digital archive. Coincidence? Perhaps. But as an investigator, I learned that too many coincidences form a pattern, and this pattern reeked of high-level manipulation. All of this led me to wonder, what if the road wasn't just a paranormal or psychological mystery, but a stage for hidden political disputes? What if behind the disappearances lay a power struggle that needed to remain secret? These questions began to shift the course of my investigation, opening the way for an even more enigmatic element: the mysterious symbols that began to appear around that cursed stretch. It was on one of my trips to the road, accompanied by an expert in ancient graphics, that I noticed something that the average eye could easily miss. Strange marks appeared on roadside stones, twisted trees, and even on the asphalt itself, as if someone had hastily left inscriptions. They weren't ordinary graffiti, but geometric symbols, intertwined lines, and figures that resembled both indigenous signs and military codes. This detail completely changed the way I viewed the situation. Common markings looked like an incomplete circle cut by a line in the middle. When I showed the photo to a historian, he told me the symbol appeared in records of ancient rites of passage practiced by people in the region centuries ago. A physicist I consulted said the same figure was used to represent magnetic fields in confidential projects. How could the same drawing carry such different interpretations? It was as if the road were a point of convergence between the sacred and the scientific. There were also reports of drivers claiming to see symbols glowing on the asphalt on foggy nights, as if they were lit from beneath the road. When they returned to the same spot during the day, they found nothing. I myself witnessed something similar. During a late-night investigation, a triangular mark seemed to glow under my car's headlights. When I got out to check, the figure had disappeared, leaving only a strange feeling, as if I'd seen something I shouldn't have. These symbols reinforced the idea that the mystery of the road wasn't random. Somehow, an intelligence, human or otherwise, was leaving traces, and if there were traces, there was intent. But what intent might that be? The answer seemed to lie buried, not only in the present, but also in the region's bloody past, a past that began to emerge in the form of stories of massacres and forgotten rituals. The deeper I dug into the historical archives, the more the road seemed to scream for attention. I discovered that this territory had been the site of brutal conflicts during the colonial period. Indigenous peoples who inhabited the region were massacred by explorers searching for land and precious metals. They say the ground was soaked in blood to the point where the earth never regained its color. This detail perhaps explains the heavy atmosphere that lingers over this stretch to this day, as if the painful memories refuse to die. I once found a letter from 1721, written by a Jesuit priest, which described a cursed path where the souls of the fallen wander restlessly. Most disturbingly, the location described in the letter coincides exactly with the route the road runs along today. It was as if the stories of disappearances today were merely the continuation of a cycle that began centuries ago. These weren't just modern disappearances, they were echoes of an open wound that never healed. Older residents reinforce this narrative. Some claim to hear drums coming from the forest on full moon nights, sounds reminiscent of ancient rituals. Others say they've found human bones in certain spots, presumably those of massacred warriors. I myself witnessed an excavation where bones were discovered just a few meters from the roadside. Science may classify them as archaeological remains, but the symbolism they carry is impossible to ignore. This historical connection adds an even denser layer to the mystery. Perhaps the road is merely the modern stage for a much older tragedy, as if the land demanded eternal payment for everything that happened there. And it was precisely when I began to understand this historical weight that new reports emerged, showing that it wasn't just people who felt the impact of the road, but also the devices we use to try to control it. If there's one thing that convinced me that the road holds more than mere legends, it was the reports, and my own experiences, of technology failing without explanation. Drivers describe cell phones suddenly dying, even with a full battery, radios that start emitting only a hiss, GPS pointing out routes that don't exist, and even car dashboards suddenly turning off. I've experienced this myself during a nighttime investigation. My recorder turned off by itself 3 times in a row, and when it came back on, it had only recorded strange noises as if someone was breathing next to me. The most curious thing is that these failures only occur within the cursed stretch. As soon as you cross the imaginary entry line, everything starts to go wrong. Lights lose power, cameras turn off, drones crash for no apparent reason. Many technicians have tried to explain it as electromagnetic interference, but they've never been able to measure anything that could explain such an anomaly. It's as if the road has its own intelligence, choosing when and how to cut the wire connecting us to the real world. A striking case involved a team of journalists attempting to film a documentary. All the cameras recorded normally until they reached the cursed kilometer. When they reviewed the footage, they discovered that the images were distorted, showing figures no one had seen at the time. In some sections, flashes of symbols similar to those I mentioned earlier appeared. The most disturbing detail is that, upon leaving the scene, the equipment returned to normal operation, as if nothing had happened. This connection between mystery and technological failure made me wonder, what if the road didn't want to be recorded? As if it repelled any attempt to decipher it. And it was precisely this type of anomaly that paved the way for one of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation. Cases in which not only the devices failed, but also entire vehicles reappeared in unlikely places without their occupants. If the disappearances were already disturbing, the unexplained reappearances were even more defiant. On some occasions, vehicles would vanish along the stretch of road and be found days later, miles away, intact, but completely empty. One of the most famous cases involved a light haul truck that disappeared one rainy night and 3 days later was located on a country road over 200 kilometers away. The engine was off, but the fuel tank remained nearly full. No sign of forced entry, no trace of a struggle, just the complete absence of the driver. One detail that always struck me was that, in these reappearances, the vehicles seemed suspended in time. Clocks stopped, radios tuned to the exact station last used, personal belongings intact, as if someone had pressed the pause button and then released it somewhere else. I myself witnessed the forensic examination of one such car. In the back seat, an open package of cookies still smelled fresh, even though the owner had disappeared almost a week ago. It was a shock to everyone present. These reappearances weren't limited to cars. There were also cases of motorcycles and even bicycles, always abandoned in perfect condition. The victims' families reported that finding the objects was worse than finding nothing, because it fueled the anguish of imagining that their loved ones were still alive, trapped somewhere inaccessible. Many believed the vehicles were returned on purpose, as if the road wanted to leave memories, proof of its strength and dominance. This idea of intentional restitution resonated deeply with me. After all, if the road has the power to swallow and then spit out whatever it desires, what message was it trying to convey? It was a macabre pattern, but one that, ironically, drew media attention, leading the mystery to take on even greater proportions, and not always with the necessary responsibility. When the highway gained coverage in newspapers and TV shows, the case ceased to be merely a local mystery and became a spectacle. Sensational headlines read, "The Highway That Swallows Drivers," or "The Kilometer of Terror." As an investigator, I closely followed this process and realized how the media could both help and hinder. On the one hand, it attracted attention, pressuring authorities to act. On the other, it spread exaggerations and distortions that confused rather than clarified. I remember a television crew that, seeking ratings, staged voices and figures in a news report. The public, of course, became even more frightened, but they also began to distrust the seriousness of any investigation. The case became fertile ground for rumors, unfounded theories, and even fraud. Some pretended to disappear to gain fame, returning days later with incredible stories. This undermined the credibility of the real victims and left their families in despair. At the same time, serious documentary filmmakers attempted to shed light on the enigma, but many had their productions halted due to lack of support or even alleged censorship. One journalist I met, obsessed with revealing the truth, reported receiving anonymous calls asking him to stop his investigation. He believed there were higher powers interested in keeping the mystery hidden, not out of superstition, but for political or economic expediency. This detail rekindled in me the connection with the conspiracies I mentioned earlier. The point is that the road became the stage for a narrative battle. On one side, the real fear of those who lost family members, on the other, the media circus that transformed pain into a spectacle. And in the midst of it all, the road remained active, attracting not only the curious but also thrill-seekers, giving rise to an even more dangerous phenomenon, the macabre tourism that has developed around the cursed kilometer. With its growing fame, the road went from being just a passing route to a destination. Young adventurers, curious people, and even legend hunters began visiting the cursed stretch simply to test whether the stories were true. I myself have encountered groups camping nearby, armed with flashlights, cameras, and even Ouija boards, as if it were some kind of supernatural amusement park. The road, once feared, became an attraction, and this only increased the number of missing people. Many of these tourists returned frustrated, witnessing nothing but darkness and silence. But others reported experiences so intense that they never repeated the visit. One young man, for example, said he parked his car at the cursed kilometer and saw approaching headlights in his rearview mirror. He thought it was another vehicle, but when he looked again, there was nothing. This detail, captured on video with his heavy breathing, went viral on social media, further fueling risky tourism. This behavior, unfortunately, reflected something I see in many other cases: the trivialization of danger. People risk their own lives in search of adrenaline or digital fame, forgetting that the mystery involves the real pain of families who have lost loved ones. I've seen desperate mothers begging these curious people to stop turning the road into a stage for online challenges. But human curiosity, as we know, is difficult to control, and the more forbidden it is, the more attractive it becomes. This macabre tourism transformed the enigma into a spectacle, but it also helped attract the attention of international researchers who began comparing the road with other similar cases around the world. It was then that I realized this mystery wasn't isolated. It was part of a global pattern of unexplained disappearances. At some point in my investigation, I realized that the road that never ends wasn't a solitary mystery. Researching cases around the world, I found disturbing parallels. The most famous is the Bermuda Triangle, where ships and planes disappear without a trace. Another example is the Dyatlov Pass in Russia, where a group of climbers died under circumstances so strange that they still fuel conspiracy and paranormal theories. Comparing the accounts, I saw similar patterns: disorientation, time distortions, and technological failures. A curious detail was how, in all these cases, geography seemed to play a crucial role. Isolated regions, steeped in bloody or mysterious histories, exhibited the same symptoms: travelers disappearing, equipment failing, and survivors reporting experiences impossible to explain. It's as if there were specific points on the planet where the normal rules of reality simply melt away, making way for another order, unknown but consistent. During a conference of independent investigators, I met with experts studying a stretch of road in Japan notorious for attracting the disappearance of lone drivers. Their description was virtually identical to our own: dense fog, a sense of a spatial loop, vehicles found empty and intact. This similarity made me wonder, are we dealing with isolated coincidences or an invisible network of portals scattered around the world? This global connection reinforced something I already sensed. The mystery of the road isn't just local, but part of a larger phenomenon, perhaps linked to the very nature of the planet or even something beyond it. And it was at this point that spiritual explanations began to gain unexpected traction, bringing to the investigation the voices of shamans, mediums, and religious figures who claimed to see what science refused to admit. When science and logic fail to explain, it's natural for the spiritual to take center stage. Many believe the road is imbued with an ancient energy, the result of massacres and rituals performed there centuries ago. Shamans in the region claim the stretch functions as a path of souls, a spiritual corridor where the living risk getting lost between dimensions. I've heard reports from mediums who, while crossing the road, felt as if invisible hands were trying to pull them out of their car. A priest I spoke with described the road as a land of penance. He believed the victims were chosen because they carried unresolved internal conflicts, and upon entering that stretch, they ended up confronting their own shadows. This explanation caught my attention because it resonated with the profiles of the victims I've analyzed. Many were in transitional phases, moments of crisis or rupture. Was it coincidence, or was there truly something deeper at play? I also met a medium who participated in a séance held on the side of the road. He said he saw figures of children running and heard voices pleading for justice. According to him, the current disappearances were not punishments, but rather invitations for new souls to be dragged into the same cycle of pain. It may sound disturbing, but looking into his eyes as he narrated, I realized there was nothing fabricated. It was as if he had seen the unspeakable. These spiritual theories may not convince the most skeptical, but the way they intertwine with the facts is impossible to ignore. And as these reports accumulated, I realized that regardless of the explanation, scientific, paranormal, or spiritual, one truth remained firm: the road remained a living enigma, an open mystery, and the big question was whether we would ever be able to solve it. After so many years of investigation, listening to survivors, family members, and experts, the only certainty that remains is uncertainty. The road that never ends remains active, and even with sections blocked by authorities, drivers still venture along it, some out of necessity, others out of pure curiosity. The disappearances haven't stopped, they've simply decreased in frequency, as if the road has learned to patiently await its next victims. And each time this happens, the mystery gains a new layer of darkness. The most disturbing thing is the feeling that somehow the road chooses. It's not just a physical space, but something that seems to have a will of its own, as if it were a living entity. I've heard people say that it feeds on human uncertainties, that it absorbs our fears and our life transitions. It may seem too poetic for a police case, but that's the impression you get when analyzing so many patterns, so many converging accounts. It's as if each disappearance is a reminder that there are forces beyond our control. What fascinates me, and at the same time unsettles me, is that the road leaves no definitive answers. It offers clues, traces, symbols, reappearances, technological failures, but never a conclusion. As an investigator, it's frustrating to work on a case that doesn't allow closure. But as a human being, it's a powerful reminder: life is made of unanswered questions, of paths that extend beyond what we can see. The road, in this sense, is a mirror of our own uncertainties. And so, every time I pass that fog-shrouded entrance, I feel the enigma still alive, waiting for the next curious soul. Maybe one day science will discover something. Maybe never. But until then, the road will continue to exist, like a cut in the map, reminding us that there are places where logic cannot enter, and where fear and mystery walk hand in hand. And it is precisely in this space of silence and doubt that our story remains open. After immersing yourself in this mystery, it's impossible to look at a deserted road the same way. The question remains: how many times have you passed by a place that seemed ordinary, but held stories you'd never imagine? The road that never ends reminds us that we don't always control the path, and that there are forces, visible or not, that can change everything in a matter of seconds. Now I ask you, do you believe these disappearances are the work of something paranormal, a hidden military secret, or simply the cruel sum of coincidences and human error? Write in the comments, because your insight may open new perspectives on this investigation. And more than that, how many roads that never end are there in your own life? Those cycles that seem to repeat themselves endlessly, situations that drain your energy and offer no way out. Perhaps the greatest lesson here is to realize when it's time to change course, before we are swallowed up by our own enigmas. If this case touched you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave your like. This way, you can continue following these stories that defy logic, and together we can keep this search for answers alive. After all, each investigation doesn't end when I turn off the microphone, but when you, on the other end, decide to reflect and act differently.